The ballroom of the Meridian Grand Hotel had never looked more magnificent. Crystal chandeliers cast their warm golden light across 200 tables draped in ivory linen, each one set with silverware that cost more per piece than most people earned in a week. The city's wealthiest donors had gathered for the annual Blackwood Foundation Gala, an event that had become as much a fixture in the social calendar as it was a demonstration of power, of who belonged and who merely served. Outside, the autumn skyline glittered with the amber lights of a city that never slept, the towers rising like monuments to ambition, each one a reminder that the world belonged to those who could afford to build it in their own image. And at the center of all of it, flanked by assistants and admirers, stood Ethan Blackwood, a man who had, by every conventional measure, conquered the world before the age of 45. He moved through the room with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never needed to rush, whose phone calls were always returned, whose opinion was always solicited. He smiled when it was required of him, spoke when it was expected, and kept the rest, the real rest, the hollow place behind his ribs that had never quite filled entirely to himself. That night, as the orchestra played, and the champagne flowed, and the city's elite laughed and networked and congratulated one another on their various successes, Ethan Blackwood reached across the edge of that hollow place and pulled something out that he had not expected to find a question. Ancient and unanswerable, dressed in the face of a woman he had never seen before in his life. The moment happened quickly, the way the most important moments always do, not with fanfare or forewarning, but with the quiet, devastating randomness of a dropped wallet on a marble floor. He had been moving through the corridor near the service entrance, looking for his communications director, when he nearly walked into one of the event staff. She was crouching to retrieve something from the floor, a small, worn leather wallet that had slipped from the pocket of her uniform jacket. He had barely glanced at her. He was Ethan Blackwood. He did not, as a rule, notice the people who set tables or cleared glasses. But then the wallet fell open on the floor between them, and something inside it caught the light, and he stopped. He stopped the way a man stops when he sees something that cannot possibly exist when the world briefly refuses to obey its own rules. The photograph was small, slightly faded at the edges, its surface cross-hatched with the fine lines of age. But the boy in it was unmistakable. The jaw was his jaw. The eyes were his eyes. The background was the garden behind his childhood home in Connecticut, the one with the old oak tree, and the crooked iron fence that his father had always meant to repair but never did. He had been perhaps 15 years old in that photograph, and it had been taken on a Sunday afternoon in late summer, and there had only ever been 4 copies made, and Ethan Blackwood had not laid eyes on any of them in more than 20 years. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "How do you have my photo?" The woman on the floor looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and steady, and something moved through them. Not surprise, not guilt, but something older and more complicated. She rose slowly, the wallet held in both hands, and she met his gaze without flinching. Around them, 2 catering staff passed by with trays of canapés, oblivious. The corridor was briefly silent. "Because your father gave it to me," she said, "the night before he died." The man the world knew as Ethan Blackwood had been built, brick by brick, on a foundation of discipline, ambition, and the particular kind of grief that disguises itself as productivity. He was 45 years old. He stood 6 feet 2 inches and wore his suits like armor, tailored to within a fraction of an inch, and chosen with the same precision he brought to every acquisition, every negotiation, every decision that had grown Blackwood Holdings from a regional property firm into a real estate empire spanning 14 states and 3 countries. His name appeared regularly in the upper tiers of Forbes lists and on the boards of hospitals and universities. He gave speeches about leadership at institutions that charged thousands of dollars for the privilege of hearing him speak. He was, by the consensus of everyone who studied such things, a success story, the embodiment of what focus and intelligence and relentless forward motion could produce. He had a penthouse on the Upper East Side, a house in the Hamptons, and a villa in Tuscany that he visited for exactly 2 weeks each August, alone, where he read books about history and walked the hills at dusk, and allowed himself, briefly, to feel something other than the drive to achieve. He had been married once, briefly, In his early 30s, a relationship that had dissolved under the weight of his schedule and his silence, leaving no children and no particular bitterness on either side, just the quiet acknowledgement that some people are better suited to solitude than partnership. He had friendships, or what passed for them among men who measured intimacy in golf rounds and board dinners. He had colleagues who respected him and competitors who feared him, and a public relations team that managed his image with the same meticulous care one might apply to a priceless but fragile piece of infrastructure. And underneath all of it, underneath the suits and the speeches and the spreadsheets and the skyline views, there was a place that had never healed, a room in the architecture of himself that he kept locked and unvisited, because inside it lived the memory of his father, and the grief of a boy who had lost the most important person in his world before he was old enough to understand what that loss would cost him. William Blackwood had died when Ethan was 16 years old. A heart attack, sudden and total, on a Wednesday morning in October. There had been no warning, no farewell, no final conversation in which wisdom was transmitted and peace was made. One morning his father was there, tall and warm and smelling of coffee and wood shavings from the workshop he kept in the garage, and the next morning he was not. The world had continued. Ethan had continued. He had channeled the loss into purpose, into ambition, into the construction of an empire that bore his family's name. He had told himself for 30 years that this was the tribute his father deserved. That success was the only language that mattered. That William Blackwood would have been proud. The annual gala was, in many ways, the purest expression of everything Ethan had built. The foundation bore his father's name. Technically, though William had never had anything to do with it, it had been established by Ethan's lawyers and accountants in the year after he made his first billion, as much a tax strategy as a philanthropic gesture, though Ethan preferred not to dwell too long on that distinction. He had grown more comfortable with it over the years, had allowed himself to believe that the money dispersed and the causes supported and the speeches given were collectively something his father might have recognized as good. The ballroom filled with the sound of music and money and self-congratulation, and Ethan moved through it like a man in his natural habitat, unaware that 30 feet away, in the service corridor near the kitchen entrance, the locked room inside himself was about to be forced open. Naomi Carter was 38 years old, and she had learned, through long practice, to be invisible in rooms where visibility was currency. She had been managing event logistics for nearly a decade, the kind of behind-the-scenes orchestration that made lavish evenings like this one appear effortless to the guests who consumed them. She coordinated the catering timelines and the vendor schedules and the seating arrangements and the 1,000 small crises that erupted and were resolved between the moment the doors opened and the moment the last guest left. She was exceptionally good at it. Her supervisor called her the most unflappable person she had ever hired, which was meant as the highest praise and which Naomi accepted with the quiet smile she kept for such occasions. She was not, by nature, a woman who sought recognition. She had grown up understanding that the world was not arranged to offer recognition to women who looked like her, and she had made her peace with that understanding a long time ago, not by accepting it as fair, it was not fair, but by deciding that her own sense of her worth would not be dependent on the conferral of others. She was tall, with the kind of stillness about her that people sometimes mistook for coldness, and that was, in fact, simply depth, the quality of someone who has lived through enough to know that most situations are less urgent than they appear. She wore her hair pulled back on evenings like this one, not because she was required to, but because it kept her focused. She did not like to be distracted. There was one distraction, however, that she permitted herself on this particular evening, and it came in the form of the man standing 40 feet away across the ballroom floor, laughing at something a white-haired senator had said, one hand resting easily on the back of a chair, his profile sharp and certain against the warm glow of the chandeliers. Ethan Blackwood. She had seen photographs of him before, of course. For years she had seen photographs of him in newspapers, in quarterly reports, on the cover of a business magazine she had found in a waiting room once, and had stared at for a very long time. She had tracked, from a careful distance, the trajectory of his career and the shape of his life, not with malice and not with admiration, but with something more complicated, with the particular attention of someone who knows that a stranger holds, without knowing it, a key to a door that has been locked for a very long time. She had carried the small leather wallet in her jacket pocket every single day for 2 decades. It was worn soft at the corners, the leather darkened by handling, the stitching frayed along one edge. Inside it, she kept only 3 things: a folded $20 bill that she never spent, a card with her mother's phone number written in her mother's handwriting, and the photograph. She had taken the wallet out that night just to look, just to ground herself, before she worked up the courage to do what she had come to do. She had not planned to drop it. She had not planned for any of this to happen in a service corridor. But then the wallet had fallen, and the photograph had slid out across the marble floor, and before she could reach it, she had looked up and found herself looking into the eyes of Ethan Blackwood, and the expression on his face had told her, with absolute clarity, that the long wait was finally over. The corridor felt very small. The sounds of the gala, the music, the laughter, the soft percussion of crystal and silverware continued beyond the door, indifferent and distant, like the noise of a world that had briefly ceased to matter. Ethan held the photograph in both hands. He had picked it up from the floor without thinking, operating on pure instinct, the way the body moves to retrieve something precious before the mind has fully processed why. He turned it over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written the date, August the 14th. 30 years ago, almost to the month. His hands were not entirely steady. He had not been aware of that until now. He looked up at the woman standing in front of him, this quiet, composed woman in the uniform of the catering staff, who had looked at him with those dark, unreadable eyes and said the most impossible 6 words he had heard in 30 years. "How do you have my photo?" He heard himself say it again, because the first time had not produced an answer adequate to the vertigo he was experiencing. His voice was lower now, rougher. Guests were beginning to filter through the far end of the corridor, and he was aware, distantly, that this was not a conversation that should be conducted in a hallway. But he could not move. The woman looked at him with patience that felt almost unbearable in its steadiness, as if she had been waiting a very long time for exactly this question and had long since rehearsed her response into something calm and solid. "Your father gave it to me," she said again quietly. "About 20 years ago. He kept it to remember you. He said he used to look at it when he missed you and didn't know how to reach you." Ethan's jaw tightened. 100 responses moved through him simultaneously. Skepticism was, among them, the sharp, reflexive skepticism of a man who had spent decades protecting himself from manipulation. But something else was there too, something older and more vulnerable, pressing against the walls he had built around it. Around them, a pair of servers passed with trays, glancing briefly at the two of them and looking away with the trained discretion of people who have learned not to notice things they are not paid to notice. Ethan straightened. He put the photograph carefully into the breast pocket of his jacket, close to his chest. "Come with me," he said. He found an empty conference room on the 2nd floor, one of the hotel's small meeting rooms, bland and corporate, entirely at odds with the gilded spectacle downstairs. He did not apologize for the abruptness with which he had led her there, because he was not at that moment thinking about manners. He closed the door. He turned to face her. "Start from the beginning," he said. "All of it." Naomi Carter sat down in one of the chairs and folded her hands in her lap, and she began to talk. She had been raised in a neighborhood in South Philadelphia, the third of 4 children, in a family that had never been comfortable with money, but had always been rich in the things that comfort cannot buy. Her father had worked 2 jobs until his health gave out, and her mother had cleaned houses and raised children simultaneously, with the kind of tireless, unsentimental grace that deserves more recognition than it ever receives. When Naomi was 18, her family had been in the worst position of their lives, facing eviction. Her father out of work after an injury, her mother stretched to the absolute limit. It was the kind of crisis that does not announce itself gradually, but arrives all at once, like a structural collapse, and leaves no margin for recovery. It was during that winter, she said, that a man had come to their door. He was white, well-dressed, older, not flashy, not arrogant, but with the kind of quiet authority that came from being secure in himself rather than needing to prove anything to anyone else. He had introduced himself simply as William. He had heard about the family's situation through a community outreach program he supported anonymously. He had not made a show of it. He had sat at their kitchen table and drunk the coffee Naomi's mother offered him, and spoken to her parents with a respect that Naomi's voice caught here, very briefly, before she steadied it, that they were not always shown by people with his kind of resources. He had helped with the rent. He had connected her father with a physician who treated his injury without charging for the consultation. He had arranged, through people he knew, for Naomi's older brother to get an apprenticeship with a construction firm. He had done all of this quietly, without ceremony, without requiring gratitude or documentation or the performance of deference. He had come back twice more over the following months. And before he came the last time, which, though none of them had known it then, would in fact be the last time he had brought something for Naomi specifically. She was finishing her senior year of high school, preparing for a future she was not sure she could afford. He had looked at her across the kitchen table and said that he admired her steadiness, her intelligence, the way she kept her head when everything around her was uncertain. And he had reached into his pocket and produced a small photograph and placed it on the table and said, "I want you to have this." It was a photograph of his son. He had not said much about the son, only that they had grown distant in the years after his wife's death, that there were things he did not know how to say, that he hoped someday the boy would grow into a man who understood what truly mattered. "Keep this," he had said, "and if you ever find yourself needing something to remind you that people can be better than the world expects them to be, look at it." 3 weeks later, William Blackwood was dead. Ethan sat very still through all of this. His face had gone through several things: the hard flatness of controlled disbelief, a tightening at the eyes, something that might have been the very beginning of grief surfacing from a place he had not visited in a long time. He said nothing for a full minute after she finished. Then, "Why didn't you come forward before?" Naomi looked at him evenly. "I tried," she said. And that was when the second layer of the story began to emerge. She had learned of William Blackwood's death through the news, the brief obituary in the business section of the Philadelphia Inquirer, the small notice that a local real estate developer had passed suddenly at the age of 53. She had been 19 then, just enrolled in a community college, the photograph still in the old wallet her brother had given her. She had felt the loss in a way that surprised her, felt it the way you feel, the loss of something you did not know you were depending on until it was gone. In the weeks that followed, she had discovered that William had been doing more than she knew. Through conversations with other families in her neighborhood, she had learned that he had been quietly supporting at least a dozen households over the preceding 5 years, not with large, dramatic gestures, but with the consistent, specific interventions that made the difference between surviving and not. Rent assistance, medical connections, job referrals, school supplies, the kind of help that was invisible to the world and invaluable to the people receiving it. When he died, all of it stopped. The families who had been receiving assistance suddenly found the support gone, with no warning and no explanation. Naomi had tried to find out who was responsible, who had been managing his affairs, who might continue what he had started. She had written 3 letters to Blackwood Holdings in the year following his death. None of them had received a response. She had tried calling twice. She had been told both times that there was no record of the philanthropy program she was describing and that the company did not have the capacity to investigate such claims. She had, eventually, stopped trying to go through official channels. But she had not stopped trying. Over the years, as Ethan's profile rose and the Blackwood Foundation was established, and the annual gala became a fixture of the city's social calendar, she had looked for openings, for moments when she might find a way to deliver what she had been carrying all this time. She had attended 2 previous galas in a professional capacity, working for event companies contracted to provide staffing. She had seen Ethan from a distance on both occasions and had not been able to reach him. This year, when she was offered the position of logistics coordinator for the event, she had accepted it knowing that she would try again and that this time she would not leave without doing what she had come to do. "I wasn't sure you'd believe me," she said. "I'm still not sure." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The skepticism was still there, but it had shifted shape, had become less like a wall and more like a question. "You said you have proof," he said. She reached under the table, where she had set the bag she had brought with her that evening, a plain canvas tote that had looked conspicuously ordinary against her uniform, and she lifted it onto the table. "I have some of it with me," she said. "The rest is at my apartment." She opened the bag and placed a small wooden box on the table between them. It was unremarkable, the kind of box sold in craft stores for storing keepsakes, with a plain hinged lid and a small brass clasp. She opened it. Inside, folded with care, were papers, letters, small photographs, a receipt, a child's drawing on yellowed paper. Ethan leaned forward. The handwriting was his father's. He knew it the moment he saw it. Knew it with the gut-level certainty that bypasses analysis and goes straight to something older, the recognition of a thing that was once known so intimately that no amount of time can fully dissolve the knowing. He had not seen his father's handwriting in 30 years. He had not kept letters. He had not, if he was honest with himself, wanted to had made a choice, after William's death, to move forward rather than backward, to build rather than to mourn. He had told himself, for 3 decades, that this was the healthy choice, the productive choice, the choice his father would have endorsed. Looking at the letters in front of him, he was no longer sure. There were 7 letters in the box. They were addressed not to Naomi but to various people: a woman named Margaret, a man named Jerome, a family referred to only as the Harpers. Each letter was brief and precise, and written in the unhurried hand of a man who meant every word he put on the page. They spoke of practical matters, of amounts transferred, of appointments arranged, of favors called in with other businessmen who owed William Blackwood something. But between the practical lines, there was something else, something that had no place in a business letter, and that William had apparently not tried to suppress: a tone of genuine care, of interest in the specific lives and specific struggles of specific people, of the kind of personal investment that is not strategic and cannot be faked. Ethan read 3 of the letters without speaking. He read the receipt, a handwritten record of a rent payment made on behalf of a family in South Philadelphia in a year that would have corresponded to the worst period of the economic cycle of that decade. He looked at the child's drawing, a crude crayon rendering of a house with a sun above it and 2 stick figures in the yard, signed in the wobbly capital letters of a young child. "Thank you, Mr. William." He set it down carefully. "How many families?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "That I know of," Naomi said. "At least 14, probably more." He processed this. 14 families, at minimum, that his father had been quietly supporting, not through a foundation, not through accountants and press releases, but person by person, kitchen table by kitchen table, over the course of years, and he had known none of it. In the weeks and months after William's death, when Ethan had been consumed by grief and then by the practical business of inheriting and managing what his father had left behind, no one had told him. Not the lawyers, not the estate managers, not the men who had served as trustees. He had not known to ask, and they had not chosen to tell him, and the result was that a quiet, patient, deeply human project had been erased from the record as thoroughly as if it had never existed. He turned back to the box. At the bottom, beneath the letters and the receipt and the drawing, was a single envelope, still sealed. It was addressed in his father's handwriting, and the name on the front was not Naomi's name and was not the name of any of the other recipients. It was his own name, Ethan. Just that, no last name, no title, as if his father had written it in a moment when formality had felt beside the point. Naomi had been watching him. "I found that at the back of the box when I organized everything," she said. "It was tucked inside a folded piece of paper, almost like he hid it. I never opened it." Ethan picked up the envelope. He held it for a moment without doing anything. His thumb moved across the sealed flap, feeling the slight ridge where the glue had dried decades ago. Outside the window of the conference room, the city continued its indifferent glitter. Somewhere below them, in the ballroom, the orchestra played on, and the gala continued. And 200 of the most powerful people in the city ate and drank and laughed, entirely unaware that in a small meeting room on the second floor, something irreversible was happening. He opened it carefully, sliding a finger along the flap, rather than tearing it, preserving the integrity of something he could not have named, but felt instinctively the need to protect. The letter inside was 3 pages long, handwritten on plain white paper, the ink slightly faded but the words entirely legible. He read it once quickly, the way you read something when you are afraid of what it says. Then he went back to the beginning and read it slowly. William Blackwood had written the letter in the last week of his life, not knowing, presumably, that it was the last week, but writing with the urgency of someone who had been meaning to say something for a very long time and had decided, at last, that the time for delay was over. He had written about his own father first, a man Ethan had only known as a figure in old photographs, hard-faced and distant, who had built the first Blackwood property business through methods that William had spent his own life trying to atone for. He had written about the guilt he carried for the wealth he had inherited, not the wealth itself, which he had worked to multiply honestly, but the foundation of it, which had been laid on ground he had not chosen and could not undo. He had written about the families. He had started helping them, he wrote, not from a strategic impulse, or a desire for recognition, or a plan to rehabilitate the Blackwood name, but from a conversation with a woman at a church fundraiser who had told him, very simply, that her family was going to lose their home at the end of the month, and she did not know what to do. He had helped her, and then he had helped someone else, and then someone else. It had grown organically, without a structure or a system, simply from the habit of paying attention to what was needed and acting on it when he could. He wrote that it was the most important thing he had ever done. Not the buildings he had developed, or the deals he had closed, or the money he had made. Not even, he wrote, and this was the line that stopped Ethan completely, not even raising his son, though he loved his son more than language could reliably express. The most important thing was the choosing, again and again, to see the people who were invisible to most of his world, and to do something about it. He wrote that he regretted the distance that had grown between himself and Ethan in the years after Ethan's mother died. He wrote that he had not known how to bridge it, that grief had made them both hard in different ways, and that he had told himself there would be time to repair it later, and that he had been wrong about that. He wrote that he was proud of his son, that he had always been proud of him, that pride in achievement and longing for something deeper were not mutually exclusive, and that he wished he had found a way to say that while they were still in the same room. And then, on the last page, in the final paragraph, in handwriting that was slightly less steady than the rest, as if he had been more affected by the writing of it than by anything else he had said he had written, the sentence that broke Ethan Blackwood open completely. If you are reading this, my son, it means someone carried it to you, and I am grateful to them for that. Live more kindly than your old man managed. Be better than I was. And if there is anything left of what I tried to do for those families, please, finish it for me. Ethan did not cry immediately. He sat with the letter for a moment, very still, the way a man sits in the seconds after a physical blow when the body is still deciding how serious the damage is. And then he put the letter down on the table and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, and the tears came not as a performance and not as a release exactly, but as the simple, physical response of a body that had been holding something too heavy for too long. He heard Naomi move slightly across the table. She did not say anything. She did not offer comfort or platitude or reassurance. She simply remained present, which was exactly the right thing to do, and which he would remember, later, as one of the most considerate things anyone had ever done for him. He was on his knees. Not metaphorically, not in the sense of defeat, but literally he had slid from the chair at some point without noticing and was crouching on the floor of a hotel conference room in a $3,000 suit, holding a letter from his dead father, weeping in front of a woman he had met 45 minutes ago. He did not feel diminished by it. He felt, for the first time in a very long time, like himself. When he could speak again, he asked her to tell him everything she knew about the families his father had helped. She did. She had been meticulous. He would come to appreciate this more fully over the following months. But even in that first conversation, he could see the shape of it. She had kept records. She had, over the years, tracked down information about the other families she had been able to identify, had maintained a quiet dossier of names and addresses and histories, not for any strategic purpose, but simply because the information felt important to preserve. She had done this, the way you do something, when you know it is right, but cannot fully explain why consistently, patiently, without the expectation of reward. She told him about Margaret Oakes, who had lost her housing when the support stopped and had spent 2 years in difficult circumstances before stabilizing. About Jerome Williams, whose employment connection William had arranged, and who had eventually built a small contracting business from that starting point, and who had tried, on his own, to pay the kindness forward without knowing where it had originally come from. About the Harper family, 3 children, both parents working minimum wage, who had received enough help to get their oldest child through the first year of a nursing program before it was cut off, and who had managed the rest through sheer determination. Ethan listened to all of it. His skepticism was gone. In its place was something that felt like the particular combination of grief and clarity that arrives when you finally see something you should have seen a long time ago, when the picture resolves and what it reveals is not comfortable, but is undeniably true. His father had been conducting a private act of human decency for years, and when he died, the people responsible for managing his affairs had quietly terminated it, either without understanding its importance or without caring, and had allowed it to disappear from the record. And Ethan, who bore his father's name and had built an empire on his father's legacy, had never known. He thought about the foundation. He thought about the galas and the speeches and the tax-efficient giving and the press releases. He thought about the ways he had been honoring his father's memory for 30 years, and he held that against what he now knew of his father's actual values, and the gap between the two was wide enough to fall into. He stood up. He picked up the letter and folded it with care and placed it back in the envelope. He looked at Naomi Carter, who was watching him with the same measured steadiness she had maintained throughout the entire conversation. "I need your help," he said. It was not a sentence, he said easily. She nodded. "I know," she said. "That's why I came." The months that followed were the most demanding of Ethan Blackwood's professional life, and also, without question, the most meaningful. He began by instructing his legal team to pull every record relating to his father's estate and the year immediately following his death. It took 3 weeks to get a complete picture, and what the picture showed was not flattering to the men who had managed the transition. There had been a line item in William's personal accounts, a recurring payment described, with masterful vagueness, as community development expenses that had been quietly discontinued in the first quarter after his death, signed off by a trustee who was no longer living, and approved by a board that had moved on years ago. There had been no inquiry, no effort to understand what the line item represented or whether it should be continued. Simply the elimination of a cost that no one had understood and no one had bothered to investigate. Ethan spent 2 hours in a room with his chief financial officer going through the numbers, and when they were done, he sat back in his chair and said, very quietly, that he wanted to restructure the foundation from the ground up. His CFO, a practical man who had been with him for 11 years, asked what he meant. Ethan told him. He meant a genuine, operational program. Not grants to established institutions where the money was absorbed into systems too large to touch specific lives. Not events and galas and branded philanthropy. A program that functioned the way his father's work had functioned, with direct relationships, specific interventions, personal accountability, small enough to be real, large enough to matter. He brought Naomi Carter in as a consultant, then as an advisor, then, once she had made clear that she was not interested in titles, but was very interested in outcomes, as the Director of Community Partnerships for the newly restructured Blackwood Foundation. She took the role on one condition that she stated plainly at their first formal meeting, that the work would be done properly, without shortcuts, and without being used as a branding exercise. Ethan agreed without hesitation. He had, over the course of several long conversations, come to understand something about Naomi Carter that had nothing to do with the extraordinary story she had carried to him. He had come to understand that she was, in the straightforward and uncommon sense of the word, good. Not naively good, not performatively good, but good in the practical way of someone who has thought carefully about what is right and has organized her life around it, regardless of the cost. Working alongside her required him to examine, on a regular basis, the distance between his intentions and his actions. He found this uncomfortable and essential. She found his wealth and connections useful as tools, which was the correct way to regard them, and treated him with the brisk respect of someone who needed him as a collaborator, but not as an authority, which was a relationship dynamic he had not experienced in decades, and which turned out to suit him rather well. The investigation into the families his father had helped took several months. Some were easy to find, they had stayed in the city, had lives that intersected in traceable ways with the community fabric. Others took longer. A few had moved across state lines, or had lost touch with people who might have provided a connection, or had names common enough to make searching difficult. Ethan hired a small research team, drawn from social work backgrounds rather than corporate intelligence, and gave them a budget and a mandate and a directive to work with Naomi's guidance rather than around it. By the time they were done, they had identified 22 families with verifiable connections to William Blackwood's informal support network. The stories that emerged from those 22 families were, individually, unremarkable, in the way that the most important human stories always are unremarkable because they were specific and ordinary and rooted in the particular circumstances of particular lives. A family that had kept a home because of a rent payment made once, at exactly the right moment. A young man who had gotten a job through a connection that William had arranged, and who had gone on to build a small business that employed 6 people. A woman who had been able to finish a nursing certification because the financial pressure on her household had eased for long enough to allow her to complete the coursework. None of it was dramatic, in the way that the word dramatic is usually meant. All of it mattered, in the way that the word mattered actually requires. Ethan attended, in person, as many of those conversations as Naomi thought appropriate. Some of the families were welcoming, some were cautious, they had learned, through experience, to be careful about people with money who arrived at their doors with talk of helping. He did not rush any of those conversations, did not try to accelerate trust through the sheer force of his resources. He showed up, he listened, he took notes, he followed up. It was slower than anything he had done in decades, and more valuable, and he felt the difference in a way that he could not have predicted from the outside. The event was held on a Thursday evening in late October, 1 year almost to the day after the night at the Meridian Grand. It was deliberately smaller than the gala that had preceded it, 120 people rather than 400, in a community hall in South Philadelphia rather than a hotel ballroom. There were no crystal chandeliers, the tables were plain. The food was good, prepared by a catering company owned by a woman who had been one of William Blackwood's families, which Ethan had learned about halfway through the year and had contacted, very simply, to offer her the contract. He had arrived early and stayed late, and for most of the evening he had moved through the room with a quality in his bearing that people noticed without quite being able to name something quieter and more deliberate than the confident ease he had projected at every previous event of his life. He gave a speech. He had written it himself, which he had not done for years, had always before relied on a communications director to shape his public words into the appropriate calibration of authority and warmth. This time he had sat alone with a legal pad for 3 evenings and written it by hand, and then read it over and crossed out every sentence that felt like performance and kept every sentence that felt like truth, until what was left was something he would not have been capable of saying 12 months earlier. He said that his father had been a great man, not in the way that word was usually applied, not in the sense of power or achievement or public recognition, but in the older sense, the sense that had to do with the quality of a person's private choices. He said that he had spent 30 years honoring a version of his father that was, he now understood, incomplete, that he had known the man who had built a company, but not the man who had sat at kitchen tables in neighborhoods like this one, and listened to people's troubles and done what he could about them. He said that he was grateful, in a way that exceeded what words were adequate to express, to the woman who had carried a piece of that story for 20 years and had found a way finally to deliver it. He looked at Naomi Carter, who was standing near the back of the room, as she had arranged to do, who had, characteristically, placed herself in the position of least visibility in a room where the story being told was substantially hers. She met his eyes and gave him the small, precise nod that he had come to recognize as her version of acknowledgement. He finished by saying what he believed to be true, that success was not what you accumulated, but what you made possible for others. That legacy was not the empire you built, but the choices you made along the way that no one recorded, that no one rewarded, that no one even necessarily witnessed. That the man he wanted to become was not the man on the Forbes list, but the man who might, someday, be worthy of the name his father had made quietly good, in kitchens and corridors, without anyone watching. The room was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then the applause came. Not the polished, reflexive applause of a charity gala, but the real kind. The kind that comes from people who have heard something genuine and are responding to it genuinely. Afterward, when the formal portion of the evening was done, and people were talking, and the energy in the room had softened into something warmer and less guarded, Naomi made her way to where Ethan was standing. She had the leather wallet in her hand. She opened it and took out the photograph, the one of a 15-year-old boy in a Connecticut garden, squinting slightly against the summer sun, entirely unaware of the 30 years that lay ahead of him. She held it out. "This belongs with the family," she said. "It always did." Ethan took the photograph. He looked at it for a long time, longer than he had looked at it that first night in the corridor, because now he saw more. He saw the boy, yes, but he also saw what the boy would become, and what it had cost him, and what he had missed along the way. He saw the man who had kept this photograph in his own wallet, who had looked at it on difficult days as a reminder of something he loved and had not known how to reach. He felt the weight of the 30 years between then and now, not as grief exactly, not as regret exactly, but as the particular kind of sorrow that is inseparable from love. The sorrow that comes from understanding, only after the chance has passed, how much something mattered. His eyes were wet. He did not attempt to disguise it. Around him, people talked and laughed, and the evening continued with the ordinary business of human connection. And Ethan Blackwood stood in the center of it, holding a faded photograph, and feeling, for the first time in as long as he could remember, that he understood where he was. There is a kind of wealth that compounds over time without appearing on any balance sheet. It does not produce dividends that can be calculated or assets that can be transferred. It is not managed by accountants or protected by lawyers or listed in the sections of documents that specify what gets passed down and to whom. It is built, instead, in the quiet moments, in the choices made when no one is watching, in the help offered without expectation of recognition, in the decision, repeated across years and circumstances, to see the people who are invisible to the powerful and to do something about it. William Blackwood had understood this. He had not broadcast his understanding, had not built a personal brand around it, or written a book or given speeches at institutions that charged for the privilege of hearing him speak. He had simply acted on it, kitchen table by kitchen table, family by family, in the years he had been given, until he had no more years left to give. And then he had trusted in that last letter, in that final gesture of faith, that someone would carry the story forward. Someone had. The foundation that bore his name was, 1 year after a dropped wallet and a question in a hotel corridor, something that he would have recognized. Not the version with the crystal chandeliers and the catering firms and the tax-efficient structures, but the real thing, the version with the direct relationships and the specific interventions and the person-by-person accountability that he had always understood as the only kind of giving that mattered. It employed 9 people, all of them drawn from the communities they served. It was working with 22 families identified through the original network and had, in the course of that first year, been approached by 30 more who had heard about it through the particular informal channels through which genuine help tends to travel. Naomi Carter directed it with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything, and she continued to decline the salary that Ethan regularly proposed upgrading, and she continued to appear, every morning, at the small office 3 blocks from her apartment, and to do the work with the quiet consistency of someone who is not interested in recognition and very interested in results. Ethan changed too, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the ways that matter most, which are usually the incremental ones. He continued to run Blackwood Holdings. He continued to make deals and build buildings and appear in the financial press. He did not abandon the empire his father had built and that he had extended. He had come to understand that it was not the empire itself that was the problem, but what you chose to do with it and what you allowed it to make you forget. He became someone who noticed more, who asked more questions that did not have an angle, who returned calls not only from people who could offer something in return, but from people who simply needed someone to pick up. He kept the photograph in the breast pocket of whatever jacket he was wearing on any given day, not as sentiment, exactly, though it was that too, but as a reminder of the boy he had been before grief and ambition had organized his life around something other than what his father had actually valued, of the man his father had been, in the quiet rooms and the unremarked moments when no one was measuring, of the woman who had carried a story for 20 years through sheer conviction that it deserved to be told, and who had found in the end exactly the right moment to tell it. A person can leave wealth for the generations that follow. They can leave property and positions and the infrastructure of power. These things are real, and they matter in the concrete way of anything that determines whether the roof over your head holds through the winter. But kindness, the particular, effortful, consistent, unrewarded kind of kindness that asks nothing and gives what is needed, that is the thing that outlasts everything else. It travels in ways that property cannot. It crosses lines that money respects. It arrives sometimes decades after the person who gave it is gone, in the form of a dropped wallet and a faded photograph and a question asked in a quiet corridor by a man who does not yet know how much his world is about to change. It finds its way. It always finds its way.